Here is something worth sitting with. Roughly 80% of people who lose weight through dieting regain most of it within 2 years. That number has not meaningfully changed in decades, despite an explosion in dietary research, nutritional products, and metabolic science. We have more information about food and the body than at any point in human history, and yet the failure rate remains almost unchanged. This is not a mystery if you understand evolutionary biology. If you are over 50 and feel like your body is no longer responding the way it once did, if you are eating less but gaining weight, moving more but recovering slowly, following advice that worked in your 30s but produces nothing now, your body is not broken. It is executing an ancient program, a program shaped not by modern medicine or dietary philosophy, but by 200,000 years of human survival. The question worth asking is not, what is wrong with me? The question is, what is my body actually designed to do at this stage of life? And why does the modern food environment work so directly against it? That gap between evolutionary design and modern dietary culture is exactly where most diets fail. And once you understand the biology behind it, the pattern becomes entirely predictable. I'm Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I've spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now, I'm here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world, and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to the evolution. If you find this kind of evolutionary perspective useful, the kind that explains why your body behaves the way it does, rather than simply telling you what to do, consider subscribing. This channel exists to offer that deeper understanding, one evolutionary insight at a time. To understand why metabolism changes after 50, you first need to understand what evolutionary biologists call life history theory. Life history theory is the study of how organisms allocate biological resources across their lifespan. Every living creature, including humans, must constantly balance 3 competing demands: growth, reproduction, and maintenance. Energy invested in one area is energy unavailable for another. This is not a limitation. It is a fundamental principle of biological design. In early life, the body prioritizes growth. In reproductive years, it shifts toward reproduction and the energy-intensive work of sustaining hormonal systems, immune function, and physical repair. But as organisms move through and beyond reproductive years, the biological calculus begins to shift again. In many species, post-reproductive life is brief or non-existent. The body has no evolutionary incentive to maintain peak metabolic performance once the primary reproductive window has closed. Energy that once supported hormonal production, lean muscle retention, and rapid cellular repair is gradually redirected or simply reduced. Humans, however, are a notable exception. We evolved an unusually extended post-reproductive lifespan, particularly in females. Evolutionary biologists have argued compellingly that this extension was adaptive. The grandmother hypothesis, first proposed in the 1990s, suggests that older adults, particularly postmenopausal women, provided significant survival advantages to grandchildren by sharing food, knowledge, and caregiving. This extended lifespan was selected for, but the metabolic profile that accompanied it was not designed for the modern food environment. In the ancestral context, the metabolic slowdown that accompanies aging was not a threat. Food was variable in availability. Calories required physical effort to obtain. The body's tendency to conserve energy more aggressively as it aged was a protective mechanism, a hedge against scarcity. What happens after 50 is not metabolic damage. It is metabolic conservation. At a biological scale, we were never evolutionarily prepared to manage in a world of caloric abundance. This is the foundation everything else builds on. Myth 1, your metabolism is simply slowing down. The most common explanation for weight changes after 50 is metabolic slowdown. The idea that the body's resting metabolic rate decreases with age, making weight management progressively harder. This is partially true, and that partial truth is exactly why it misleads people. A landmark study published in the journal Science in 2021, which tracked total energy expenditure across more than 6,000 individuals from 8 days old to 95 years old, found something that challenged decades of assumption. Metabolic rate does not begin a meaningful age-related decline until after 60. Between the ages of 20 and 60, when adjusted for changes in body composition, resting metabolic rate is remarkably stable. Let that settle for a moment. The widespread belief that metabolism begins dramatically slowing in the 30s or 40s, a belief repeated so frequently it has become cultural fact, is not well supported by the current evidence. What does change significantly between 40 and 60 is body composition. Lean muscle mass declines. Fat mass tends to increase. Because muscle is metabolically more active than fat, a person with less lean tissue burns fewer calories at rest. But this is a composition change, not an intrinsic metabolic failure. The distinction matters enormously because these two things require completely different responses. If the problem is metabolic rate, the logic of eating less makes sense. If the problem is composition, eating less without addressing muscle retention often accelerates the very process driving the change. Most diets designed for adults over 50 focus on caloric restriction. They treat a composition problem like a consumption problem, and they do so in a body that has evolved over millions of years to defend its fat stores against restriction. This is not a coincidence. It is evolutionary logic colliding with modern dietary design. Myth 2. Eating less is the primary solution. Let's step back for a moment. If you remember nothing else, remember this. The human body did not evolve to respond cooperatively to caloric restriction. It evolved to survive it. Our ancestors lived in an environment characterized by intermittent food availability. Periods of abundance were followed by periods of scarcity. The bodies that survived were those most capable of responding to reduced caloric input by becoming more efficient. Lowering energy expenditure, increasing appetite signaling, and prioritizing fat storage when food returned. This is not a design flaw. It is precisely the feature that kept human populations alive through ice ages, droughts, and failed hunts. When a modern adult over 50 reduces caloric intake significantly, they trigger a cascade of adaptive responses. Leptin levels fall, increasing hunger. The thyroid may downregulate slightly, reducing metabolic output. The body reduces non-exercise energy expenditure, the unconscious movement and fidgeting that accounts for a meaningful portion of daily caloric burn. Appetite hormones shift in the direction of increased desire for energy-dense foods. In short, the body interprets dietary restriction as a survival threat and responds accordingly. In an ancestral environment, this response was life-saving. In a modern food environment where calorie-dense processed foods are available at every turn, this same response drives people directly back to the foods that caused weight gain in the first place. Studies on long-term dietary restriction consistently show that after initial weight loss, between 80 and 95% of participants regain the weight within 3 to 5 years. The body's counter-regulatory mechanisms are simply more powerful than most people's capacity for sustained willpower. Willpower is not the variable, biology is. This understanding does not make dietary change impossible. It makes clear why dietary change, without addressing the evolutionary biology driving hunger and storage, produces such consistent long-term failure. Consider someone like Margaret, a retired teacher in her mid-50s, conscientious, informed, and committed. She reduces her daily caloric intake, loses 12 pounds over 4 months, and within a year has regained 15. She blames herself, but her body executed exactly the program it was designed to execute. The environment it encountered provided no signal that the scarcity had ended. Margaret's story is not unusual. It is the statistical norm, and it points directly toward the next myth, one that would have changed everything for her. Margaret kept a food journal. She tracked her macros. She reduced processed foods, increased vegetables, and stayed within her target calorie range for months at a time. By most conventional measures, she was doing everything right, and yet something wasn't adding up. Her clothes still fit the same way. Her energy was lower than she expected, and when her doctor reviewed her blood work, her fasting glucose had drifted upward, not dramatically, but enough to warrant a conversation. She wasn't eating too much. She was moving too little, and the distinction matters enormously. What Margaret's dietary program never addressed was the progressive loss of skeletal muscle that had been occurring quietly across the previous decade. By her mid-50s, she had lost a meaningful percentage of the lean tissue that her body relied on to clear glucose from the bloodstream after meals. She had become, in biological terms, less metabolically capable, not because of what she was eating, but because of what her muscles had stopped doing. No calorie reduction could fix that. No dietary protocol could restore insulin sensitivity in tissue that was no longer there. The intervention she needed was mechanical, not nutritional, which brings us to the third myth, and the one that most directly explains why Margaret's careful eating produced such disappointing results. Myth 3, dietary quality alone determines metabolic health. The third myth is more subtle and in some ways more damaging than the others. There is a widespread belief, reinforced by decades of nutritional messaging, that metabolic health after 50 is primarily a function of what you eat. Choose the right foods, eliminate the wrong ones, and the body will regulate itself appropriately. The biology tells a more complicated story. Metabolic health in older adults is heavily influenced by mechanical loading. Skeletal muscle, the body's primary site of glucose uptake, is not a passive tissue. It responds to physical demand. When muscles are regularly contracted against resistance, they become more sensitive to insulin, the hormone responsible for shuttling glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. When muscles are underloaded, that sensitivity decreases. Blood glucose remains elevated for longer after meals. The body compensates by producing more insulin. Over time, tissues become resistant to insulin signals, and a condition develops that is associated with fat accumulation, systemic inflammation, and metabolic dysfunction. The key insight here is that this process is mechanical, not merely nutritional. Ancestral populations did not maintain metabolic health in their later decades because they ate perfectly formulated diets. They maintained it because their bodies experienced constant, varied, load-bearing physical demand, carrying, climbing, digging, walking across uneven terrain. This mechanical input was a continuous signal to skeletal muscle to remain metabolically active. Modern adults over 50 exist in environments that have largely removed this mechanical demand. Sedentary professional life, car-dependent transport, chairs that support the body passively, these remove the physical signals that muscle tissue requires to maintain insulin sensitivity. Dietary quality matters, but it cannot fully compensate for the absence of mechanical loading signals that muscle evolved to receive. This is why two individuals eating similar diets can have dramatically different metabolic profiles depending on their movement patterns, and why dietary interventions that do not address physical demand, however nutritionally sound, often produce incomplete and frustrating results. The body does not regulate metabolism through food choices alone. It regulates metabolism through a complex integration of nutritional input, hormonal signaling, and, critically, the mechanical signals that tell the body how much metabolically active tissue to maintain. Myth 4. Metabolism after 50 is fixed. The fourth myth may be the most limiting of all because it operates as a ceiling on effort. The belief that metabolic changes after 50 are largely irreversible, that the body has crossed a threshold beyond which meaningful change is no longer possible, is both biologically inaccurate and evolutionarily illogical. Consider what evolutionary biology tells us about the nature of adult physiology. The human body did not evolve to reach a fixed metabolic state and remain there. It evolved to respond continuously to environmental signals. This capacity for adaptive response does not simply switch off at a particular age. Research on skeletal muscle biology has consistently demonstrated that muscle tissue retains substantial plasticity well into the 7th and 8th decades of life. Resistance training in older adults produces measurable increases in muscle cross-sectional area, strength, and, importantly, insulin sensitivity. These are not marginal improvements. Studies have documented meaningful functional gains in adults in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s. The body's fat storage and mobilization systems also retain responsiveness to environmental input. Sleep quality influences cortisol and insulin regulation in ways that directly affect fat metabolism. Protein intake at or above threshold levels, which in older adults tends to be higher than standard dietary recommendations, supports the synthesis of new muscle protein and can slow the compositional drift that drives apparent metabolic change. Even circadian alignment, the alignment of eating, movement, and sleep with the body's internal biological clock, has measurable effects on metabolic function. Research in chronobiology has shown that eating patterns misaligned with circadian rhythms impair glucose tolerance and fat oxidation independent of total caloric intake. None of this is optimization language. This is the body responding to biological signals the way it evolved to respond to them. The metabolic profile of an adult over 50 is not a verdict. It is a current state shaped by current inputs. Change the inputs meaningfully and consistently, and the biology follows. But there is an important qualification. The time scale and the expectations must match the biology. The rapid transformations promoted by short-term dietary programs are not aligned with how the body adapts over the lifespan. Sustainable metabolic improvement in older adults tends to be gradual, nonlinear, and dependent on environmental redesign rather than temporary behavioral effort. Understanding these four myths makes the structure of the modern diet industry's failure almost predictable. The industry was not designed around human evolutionary biology. It was designed around human psychological vulnerabilities, specifically the deep evolutionarily ancient craving for rapid solutions to survival threats. Our ancestors faced metabolic threats in the form of starvation and energy scarcity. The instinctive response to such threats is urgency. Find food, find it fast, act decisively. This urgency was adaptive in the ancestral context. It is exploited commercially in the modern one. The diet industry sells urgency, rapid weight loss, dramatic transformations, 30-day protocols, before and after timelines compressed to fit a sales narrative. And because the body can produce short-term results through restriction, temporarily suppressing appetite through novelty, reducing water retention through carbohydrate reduction, dropping scale weight through caloric deficit, these programs appear to work initially. But they are working against the biology of an organism that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to resist exactly this kind of intervention. Ultra-processed foods, engineered to precisely match the caloric density and sensory profiles that trigger maximum reward in the human brain, exploit the same evolved preferences that once guided ancestral humans toward the most energy-rich available foods. The brain's reward system cannot easily distinguish between the nutritionally appropriate pursuit of ripe fruit or bone marrow and the neurologically similar response to a highly engineered snack product. The signal feels identical. The metabolic consequence is entirely different. And here is the particularly important part for adults over 50. The sensitivity of reward systems to these engineered foods does not necessarily decrease with age. In some respects, as other sources of novelty and stimulation become more constrained in later life, the pull of familiar rewarding foods may become more pronounced. Meanwhile, the physiological consequence of consuming these foods, the insulin response, the inflammatory signaling, the disruption of appetite regulation, compounds the metabolic challenges that are already biologically heightened in this life stage. It is a system designed, however unintentionally, to produce repeated failure. And that failure is then attributed to the individual, to lack of discipline, to aging, to personal weakness, rather than to the fundamental mismatch between modern dietary culture and evolved human biology. Here is where the evolutionary perspective produces its most practically useful reorientation. The framing of most dietary intervention after 50 is weight reduction. The goal is a number on a scale, a reduction in clothing size, a before and after contrast. And this framing, however culturally entrenched, is biologically misaligned with what the body in this life stage actually needs and is actually capable of. Evolutionary biology suggests a different primary goal: metabolic stability. Metabolic stability means maintaining the functional capacity of the body's key regulatory systems: insulin sensitivity, glucose metabolism, lean tissue mass, systemic inflammation levels within ranges that support long-term functional independence and reduce disease risk. This is a fundamentally different goal from weight loss, and it produces fundamentally different strategies. Weight loss pursued through restriction tends to reduce lean tissue alongside fat, particularly in older adults where protein synthesis is already less efficient. This accelerates the compositional drift that drives the very metabolic problems being addressed. Metabolic stability pursued through resistance-based movement, adequate protein, and consistent sleep produces the opposite effect. It targets the compositional and hormonal drivers of metabolic dysfunction without triggering the body's survival mode counter-response. The decline in estrogen that accompanies menopause alters fat distribution patterns, shifting storage toward visceral fat, which is metabolically more active and associated with higher inflammatory signaling than subcutaneous fat. This shift is driven by hormonal change, not caloric excess. Dietary restriction addresses caloric balance. It does not address hormonal environment. Similarly, the gradual decline in testosterone in males across midlife and beyond affects the body's capacity for muscle protein synthesis and its hormonal environment for fat metabolism. These are not problems solvable by choosing different foods. They require addressing the hormonal and mechanical context in which food is being metabolized. The body is not a calorie calculator. It is an evolved organism responding to a complex environment. Treating it like a calculator produces calculator-shaped results, precise in theory, inadequate in practice. If the biology points away from restriction-based dietary approaches and toward a more integrated understanding of metabolic health, what does a practically useful evolutionary framework actually look like? The first principle is environmental design over behavioral effort. Hunter-gatherer populations did not exercise as a deliberate practice. They moved because their environment required it. They ate varied whole foods not because of nutritional philosophy, but because that was what was available. The health behaviors that evolutionary biologists associate with ancestral populations emerge from structural features of their environment, not from sustained personal discipline. The practical implication is that lasting metabolic improvement in modern adults is far more reliably produced by changing the environmental inputs that shape behavior than by attempting to override biology through willpower alone. This means making load-bearing movement a structural part of daily life, not as a scheduled exercise intervention, but as an integrated feature of the environment. Carrying objects, climbing stairs, walking across varied terrain, lifting and moving in ways that apply consistent mechanical demand to major muscle groups. The specific modality matters less than the consistency and the mechanical loading. It means restructuring the food environment to reduce the friction required to access nutritionally appropriate foods and increase the friction required to access the ultra-processed products that most directly exploit evolved reward systems. This is not about moral judgment. It is about recognizing that the brain's decision-making systems are heavily influenced by availability and ease of access. It means taking circadian biology seriously, not as a wellness trend, but as a foundational feature of human physiology. The body's metabolic processes are organized around a roughly 24-hour internal clock, calibrated over millions of years by the consistent cycling of light and darkness, consistent sleep timing, exposure to natural light during daytime hours, and avoiding the light and eating patterns that signal to the body that it is simultaneously day and night. These are not optimizations. They are basic alignment with evolved physiological design. And it means revising expectations about the timescale of change. The body adapted to an environment over hundreds of thousands of years. It responds to a new environment over months and years, not days and weeks. The cultural expectation that meaningful metabolic change can be produced in 30 days is not grounded in biology. It is grounded in the sales cycle of the diet industry. Think of someone like David, a man in his late 50s, formerly active, now working from home, moving very little, noticing gradual weight accumulation around the midsection despite no significant change in diet. The dietary advice he receives focuses on what he is eating, but the primary variable driving his metabolic shift is not food quality. It is the near complete removal of mechanical loading from his daily environment. Restoring that mechanical input through something as structurally simple as walking with load bearing using stairs or adding 2 sessions of resistance work per week begins to address the biological driver of the change, not through punishment, not through restriction, through alignment. We began with a question worth sitting with. If the failure rate of dieting has remained near 80% for decades across different dietary philosophies, different food cultures, different levels of scientific understanding, then perhaps the problem is not insufficient information about food. Perhaps the problem is a fundamental misalignment between the framework we are using to understand metabolism and the biology we are actually working with. The evolutionary perspective suggests that this is precisely